Welcome to A Place for Film, the IU Cinema podcast. On this week's episode, we're talking to visual effects artist Hoyt Yeatman. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the show. My name is Andy Hunsucker.
And I'm Jason Thompson.
And on this week's episode, Jason, we've got a very special guest, a little cut above, not to besmirch our normal guests,
Sure.
but a traveling guest, one that came to us from far away, Hoyt Yeatman. And if you don't know that name, I'm sure you've seen his work in many films. Look at this guy's Internet Movie Database page. It's unreal, Jason.
It's very impressive.
Like every film you've loved for the past 40 years, he has worked on. So you're a visual effects supervisor,
Yes.
Hoyt, and you're here talking to faculty and stuff.
Exactly.
And you are going to be back here on October 8th and 9th
Yes.
with something at the cinema.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to talk a couple different films. We're kind of deciding which films to talk about, but we're going to kind of show and tell what I was doing in those years and what's interesting about it.
Yeah, and that's what I find so interesting about your career. You're not a guy who's been here for a few years. You've been here for the whole breadth of the visual effects, sort of the big changes that have been happening.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about that later. Okay. All right. Well, let's talk to Hoyt Yeatman. I'm looking at your filmography. There's so much interesting stuff to talk about. But I just want to start with, visual effects. How did you get interested in visual effects?
Yeah, interesting. Back when I was 8 years old, I knew at that time what I wanted to do. I didn't know I wanted to do specifically visual effects, but I started making movies. And it was with the family's regular 8, not the Super 8 camera, and stop motion animation using things like eggs and pipe cleaners and things like that. And then in high school, got interested in live action, started shooting your own movies like most kids would do, are interested in film and cinema. And then at UCLA, I combined, again, the live action and the animation together, following in the footsteps of what I, with my mentor at that time, Ray Harryhausen, or still was, who I got to know actually quite well, who has since passed, obviously. But he was a great guy. And so that was where I used miniature front screen projection with stop-motion characters with the traditional foam rubber latex and armatures underneath, along with 16mm projection to combine the live action with the animation. So I was well on my way, and this is, in the late 70s. And then I was very fortunate, and when I was graduating from UCLA, they needed an intern or PA to work on Close Encounters on the visual effects. This is Douglas Trumbull, who is kind of credited as kind of the grandfather of modern visual effects. And so knowing very little other than just basic stuff, I went to work, and I worked for Dennis Muren, who's the Academy Award winner multi-time. I think it's 9 times. He's probably got the most Academy Award of anyone. And they were shooting the mothership sequence, and that's where the big thing comes down. And this is the world when we were using a thing called the mini scan, which was basically a little box that had a bunch of toggle switches and thumb wheels, and it was 7-minute exposures, and they were shooting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, trying to get the movie done. And so I was there at 7 in the evening till 7 in the morning, sitting in a little dark room, flipping switches. It was a horrible little thing, but I was happy as a clam to go do it. So that got me in. And so when I graduated, I immediately began working more with Doug, and we worked on Close, Blade Runner, Star Trek 1, and so I learned from the very best at that time. So that was a very fortunate moment. And again, it was a very primitive kind of technology compared to what we have today.
Yeah. Jason, there's worse first jobs to have than Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And then it's like, I'll just go do Star Trek the Motion Picture after that.
Well, what's interesting, because it was really riding the crest of because you think in the late 77 when Star Wars came out and Close Encounters, they really kind of put on the map the idea of visual effects. But back then, it was really star fields and environments and things like that, as opposed to where we are now, which is much more character and things.
Yeah.
And I'd imagine, too, back then, taking a risk on a film like that for the general public, of course, you got your Star Trek audience, and then taking sort of that leap of faith that, more people will come and see those movies. I'm sure it's not, to us now, it's like, hindsight is always 20/20.
Yeah.
But,
well, Doug really was a pioneer. He was brilliant. He was probably 20 or 30 years ahead of his time. I mean, one of the things that was interesting back then was he worked in a process called show scan, which at that time was 65mm 5-perf running at 60 frames a second. And his vision of the modern theater would be at those kind of frame rates. And we now reflect back on The Hobbit, which was 48 frames per second. So he just didn't have the infrastructure set up to be able to pull that off, but he was a visionary in those terms.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I do want to talk about Star Trek the Motion Picture for a second, because I'm a huge Star Trek nerd.
Oh, okay, good.
A lot of people sort of trash that movie as like, oh, it's not a very good Star Trek film. I've watched it recently. It's a really good film.
Yeah, it holds up.
It's very
especially in the effects department.
Yes.
And it really almost harkens back. It's almost like the anti-Star Wars. Like it almost goes all the way back to like 2001.
Yeah.
And really kind of focuses on that. Could you talk maybe about
absolutely.
how that...
Yeah, because it was. I think people were expecting Star Wars. They were expecting more battle and energy, and this was more slower paced, beautiful things. Doug always shot in 5 perf 65, and back in the theaters in those days, you could go to select theaters and see something in Super Panavision, which was 65. But in truth, all the composites were done in 35 and then blown back up with the rest of the movie. But on that show, the Enterprise, which I got to shoot, I did most of the shots with the Enterprise, and the ones where it does the warp drive, where slit scan with stuff we did with mini scans and controllers and things like that, were great. But it was really a beautiful thing, and we would see the dailies in 65 millimeter. We were the only ones that got to see it because the public saw a reduced version of it, you know. But we worked again with the very best, and it was a beautiful film, but much slower paced. I think that they wanted to see, you know, what they're expecting. You know, this was a shared show between, at that time, Apogee with John Dykstra, who's also credited with the original Star Wars, and he did, like, for instance, the opening sequence with the Klingon ship where the camera comes over, spins around, and then goes back. And then I did that. Actually, I was asked to do, and I did the ending sequence where the Enterprise comes over and does a similar type move to kind of bookend the whole show. You know, it was really fun to see and to work on. Again, another privilege to be able to do that.
So the sort of, to use a sort of crude term, starship porn of the Enterprise in dry dock.
Yes.
You shot that?
Yes, with 2 other guys. Yeah, exactly. The interesting thing back then, we were using the technology at that time, which was from the Star Wars and Close Encounter era. And again, much like the bow and arrow, people kind of think of it at the same time. This was the primitive, we call it the mini scan. And what it was a box about the size of a refrigerator. And the way that technology worked back then, we didn't generate things with computers, and we didn't even have a computer in the box. It was hardware oriented, and we used a thing called stepper motors, which are basically an electric motor that when you send it a pulse, it would basically turn the motor a fraction of a revolution. So we used audio cassettes, if you can believe this, in the system. And when I turned a knob, it would be bop, 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 bop. You actually record the physical pulses onto the audio tape. And then, so if you were animating a starship, you know, the one first would maybe be the track move that you have, right? And you're moving the camera, not the model, to pull back, and it looks like the model's leaving camera, right? And then you lay that down, then you play that tape back in real time, and then you add the other channel, which might be the pan, to make it look like it's turning off to the left, right? So my animation skills from the stop motion work that I did from the age 8 became applicable when I'm actually animating motors, you know, with this very mechanical way. And that lasted, you know, for in the world of film for about maybe 2 or 3 years. And then we began to work with computers, PCs at those times, and making computers run the motors, and we had all kinds of stuff. But it was an amazing time because you were only a handful of people on the planet that had that technology. And it was an organic technology, meaning that unless you cranked out of a solid billet of aluminum your camera movements and printers and you built the hardware, you couldn't do the work. So we were really, at that time, I think, looked more like wizards because
Absolutely.
We're unique, you know.
Yeah. Well, so how big a model did you have on that?
Well, the Enterprise was about 12 feet long.
Oh, wow.
And it was built by Mark Stetson, and it was done in pearlescence. And so someone sat down and basically put, you know, little things in airbrush and built the whole thing. It took, you know, months to build in the model ship. The little escape pod that came out with Spock, you know, was basically a model about maybe 2 or 3 feet big. And in the front was the projection, which they had shot Spock standing against black, and we would project 1 frame at a time into it. And these are what we call multi-pass. In other words, to get the dry dock, what has that beautiful lens flare. And it's kind of a signature of Doug Trumbull's Blade Runner's filled with that, with all those lens flares, is, you know, maybe 20 or 30 passes of the film in the camera. So you'll put a set of filters on the camera, you'll smoke the stage up, you know, and then to a certain level, and we have basically like a mole smoke, which is an oil-based smoke, and you have fans in the ceiling that homogenize it, and you use a laser beam that keeps that room consistent level of fog, and then the computer plays back the move, you know, and or the tape is playing, and it plays back the move, and you expose just the lights against black in this fog. Then you back the film back up, back the rig back up, change the environment, put different filters, and do it. And so it's like painting in watercolor, where you're laying one on top of the other, you know. So this is kind of primitive. And it's interesting to note that Star Trek was done without any traveling map, because back in those days, 65 millimeter did not have the capability of registration to hold for doing, so we were using front screen projection and other techniques to actually make the traveling map work.
Now, do you do you then composite those images together later on, or do you?
Yeah, no, those elements are shot.
over-
Yeah, in other words, to pull the ship so it's against a star field, we would then do a front and backlight, it's called, where the model movers themselves are clad in neon. And they were then illuminated, and then we put a big screen where it was usually black velvet. We put a white screen, and then we would shoot. Because the cameras repeat that accurately, you can shoot a piece of film that is essentially the holdout. Now, for me, what happened, I had, again, the great opportunity of working with a gentleman named John Ellis, who his dad was one of the inventors of the optical printer. And this goes back to even Linwood Dunn, who's another renowned name for doing it, which I got to know. And so he physically, and this is a man I met when I was shooting, and he had a white lab coat on. He was in the machine shop. And I said, this guy's a machinist, right? So he machines this thing literally out of solid blocks of aluminum, right? And he builds this massive piece of equipment on the show, and then when he's all done, he takes the coat off, walks in, and he starts compositing. And so one of the things that we did was from the stage, you learn very quickly when you're trying to make the time and you got to get done, and don't worry about this, we'll fix it in post, that expression that came out, we'll fix it in opticals. Well, I then had to go from the stage to work the night shift, which we usually did, with John Ellis. And so you then began working with the film elements that you had shot before, and you learn all the things that you should not have done on the stage. Very, very educational type process. Yeah.
Well, do you feel like, is that something that's still around that model makers now and, 3D model makers are still learning about? Or
yeah,
is
well,
that...
that's a sad part of, I think, the movement where we are. I mean, we don't do much physical modeling anymore. That was the best part, is to have a model shop. Like when I did The Abyss, we had massive models and things like that, in there, which was fun, to really show and tell. It's all now kind of done digitally. There is sometimes a throwback to doing traditional models, but it's becoming a lost art, actually, which is kind of sad to see. Most everything now is done in the computer, and for reasons that it makes sense to do it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. I would like to talk about that transition.
Oh, sure. Yeah, let's do it.
But I want to I want to stay here in this era, because I love this era.
It's a beautiful era.
But let's talk about why all of that stuff holds up, because I can watch Close Encounters or Star Trek, and it looks just as good as it did back then.
Yes.
And no matter how many models somebody makes, nobody's going to make a better looking model.
Yeah.
But we went through this transition period where 3D modeling was terrible for a long time.
Yeah, and the actual digital quality was very bad too.
Yeah,
when we went through that. Yeah.
So I mean, how do you
deal with that? Yeah, because back in the analog days where you had physical models, there was an artistry behind it, and because you're taking kit bashing, where you take tank model parts and you glue it on the surface and you build something, you make molds and you cast it. I mean, you have 40 people working on one model for several months, There's a certain magic that comes from that. And then also using beautiful photography and great lighting DPs that work in that area. It's kind of exquisite. And you have also filters with scratch filters and lens flares and things like that you just have a tough time duplicating that in the digital world, There's also was a lot more thought that had to go into the planning and the execution of those shots, because you didn't have the trickery. You didn't have the wire removal. You didn't have the rig removal. You had to get it more in camera, and that always tends to look better and look more real because it's actually there.
Yeah.
So those were the things that kind of drove us in doing it. Not to leap ahead, but like the reason I think that I got a chance to do The Abyss is that when Jim Cameron was talking about using in South Carolina real submersibles in a real tank, I realized that we were going to have to cut up against real underwater footage. And so using the traditional means of even using motion control and models would not work, because you're shooting separate elements. And again, you're trying to go through an optical printer, through a photographic compositing process to make it look organic, and that would not work. And so what we did is we made a dry for wet technology, which is where we took the motion control, instead of running it on the floor, which is traditionally how you would do it with tracks and cameras, we hung it from the ceiling from a computerized crane. Right? And so there were up to 58 different individual channels working, and we made essentially a giant marionette. So the 8-scale flatbed and the subs were actually hung from the ceiling from an overhead gantry that was computer controlled. There was a system based on a swash plate bleeding off of an RC helicopter, and that's what gives the rotor movements. And so there are 11 kind of points that come out, and the 11 music wires come down to support the ship. It's basically a parallelogram. So when the tilt plate rotated, the ship would rotate. And then we had to carry the lights, because the ships were equipped with lights, and they were using NiCads. And NiCad batteries don't like like to burn for lengths of time because they would go out. So we'd cycle them. So the computer would say to the camera, if you think about a camera shutter, the camera starts for the first 180 degrees making the exposure. And then the latter 180 degrees is the shutter closing where the film advances, just like on a movie projector. And so during the dark time, if you're talking about 30-minute exposures or 30-second exposures, it would be 1 minute to get that frame through the camera. So half of that time would be dead time. So we would actually tell the computer, shut the lights off on the model. So what we would do is, again, we pump the room down really heavy in this homogeneous smoke. The control rooms were pressurized. Guys would come out in literally gas masks. We had a 65-foot Trident submarine sitting there, and these marionettes running in the ceiling. Again, they were repeatable. We carried process projectors inside, and it was the neatest thing. It's like an underwater aquarium all moving in slow motion, But again, being done for the most part in camera, it had a look that looked completely real, and that's what we're looking at. But those was an era where you really had to be innovative in a physical medium. You're working with lasers and reflecting plastics under ultraviolet, coming up with kind of interesting solutions to photographic problem.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's something else I kind of want to talk about. I want to go back for a second.
Yeah, go back to, exactly.
Yeah. So, talking about the early days of like 3D effects and that sort of thing, going back to the early days of special effects, things like King Kong still really hold up.
Yeah. Right.
But I find it interesting what you said about, you were driven to make it look really good when you have a model. Did something change when it was like 3D effects? Was it too easy for people to just say?
No, because the transition into digital, we really lost quality. Because, a real true film frame, if you take it, is somewhere around 4K. And so when we shifted to that world, we were still in videotape and still in NTSC and things like that. And there were many groups that tried to make that translation. If you look at the visual effects kind of history, the stained glass man out of the Young Sherlock Holmes was the first kind of 3D character that hit the big screen in a way, and that was ILM.
Yeah.
Also on the Abyss, the kind of computer graphic generator was the pseudopod, and later to be followed by the Terminator series where you had the chrome guy and the liquid mercury type Gary. And again, that was the original element was generated with computer graphics, but the actual compositing was done through traditional optical printing.
Oh, okay.
So it was kind of a hybrid approach. In the striving for the accuracy and for original qualities, we were one of the few companies that did what we call original matte paintings. When you go and you have to change the background via a true painting. And Albert Whitlock, I don't know if you know that name, but he's a renowned artist since, passed away, but he was at Universal, did all of Hitchcock's movies, stuff like that. And original matte painting is a very interesting and very simplistic approach, but is kind of scary when you think about it. You take the original negative, and when you're out on the shoot with the cast, you put out in front of the camera maybe 2 to 3 feet goalposts in which you put either a sheet of glass or maybe a piece of cardboard, and you throw a big piece of black over the camera. The grips do that for you. And you put tape and masking paper, and you mat out the areas that you want to eventually paint in. Right? You do it actually on the set or on the location, right? And then you roll camera, and the director says action, and the characters do whatever they're going to do, And then when you're done, you do that 3 times, which is like asking for the world to get the actors to do it 3 times, right? And each time you do it, you stop the camera, open the camera door, and with a punch, you punch the side of the film. Okay, so you mark it, right?
Yeah.
And then you go to the next take. Then when you're done with 3 successful takes, you then roll the camera for 4 minutes or 400 feet of film. It is the longest 4 minutes you've ever seen. And at $100,000 a day, the ADs are going, oh my God. But you roll that. Then what happens is back in post, you go in and you take your footage, you rewind it in the dark, and when your finger comes against the notch, you break the film. And so that's take 1, and you put it in the freezer, and you do that for take 2 and take 3. And then the 400 feet that you shot, or the 4 minutes of film, about a minute, 90 feet a minute, you would then put that into the camera, and you would have to figure out the framing. So you actually process a bit in black and white, cut at an angle, reassemble it, figure out where the frame lines, load it in the camera properly. And then the artist would take a black board, something with shiny black, and he would paint with artist colors onto where the painting wasn't, where that live action wasn't, and he'd paint that, and you have no feedback, right? And then you put that up, and then you shoot a couple frames with an animation camera on that footage, and you send it to the lab, and it comes back, and of course it's horrible, it doesn't match like that. And then you'd look at it, and then you'd have to examine the negative because that had the information. So you'd look at it, and you see it. So very quickly, it took us weeks to get that to work, and when you finally got the image to look correct, you'd show the director, here's a 15-second burst. What do you think? And you go, oh, it looks good. And you go, okay, great. You go back into the refrigerator, You take that take one. You load it back in the camera, you make sure it's in frame, and then you roll the film through. And if you do it right, it is called original negative because it has the same generation quality as the original image. There is no loss, right?
Yeah.
And Albert Whitlock made a whole career doing it, and we followed in that footsteps and learned it. But to see what we can do now, like in Photoshop, you put it up, you put it down, it's like it's cheating, you know?
I'm a Photoshop artist myself.
Yeah, exactly.
What you're describing sounds horrifying.
Yeah, exactly. And then later in scenes like Close Encounters and in others, because of the fact that original negative scared the pants off of most people, or the fact that you need to combine that with other elements like, you know, UFOs or spaceships and things like that, it wasn't really practical. So what happens, you have to paint for what they call the intermediate stock. This is where in the laboratory process, the original negative is copied onto a piece of film that's designed to look at a piece of film. It's extremely slow, meaning it's about ASA 1, because it's designed to work photographically with a minimum amount of grain. And because it's designed to look at an orange base, because if you look at film negatives, it's got this orange mask, right? You then had to put that orange mask in front of the camera and fool the camera when it's photographing the painting so it would see the paint. And because it's low contrast, you had to paint in low contrast. So now we're asking the matte artist to paint in weird colors in a low contrast mode in blind because he can't see it. So we do the exact same thing. Then now it's gobs of light on this poor painting, which you'd warp and crack glass, you know, because it's so hot with fans burning. And then you'd have 3 or 4 second, minute, you know, exposures on this thing, really. And then you'd get this thing back and you'd look at it. So it was really a performance. When you did something like that, you weren't guaranteed that you could do it again the same way. It was really an art and performance to the process, as opposed to today where you get the shot back and, I want to change that. You change one little bit of the code, you hit the button, and it's going to work, you know. It was very, very different back then.
So, you know, I do a little bit of visual effects myself, just a little bit. But I always find that organic things are the hardest thing to kind of fake. Was that
Still
the way
case.
it was?
Yeah, it really was. I mean, I think, you know, there's in the span of movies you do, sometimes you're requested to do something completely real, and if you don't see it, we're all going, wow, wow, wow. But then your peers say, what would you do in the movie? You know, you don't really see it. You know, then you go, well, we did this. You know, other times it's fantastical and should be fantastical and stand out. The more satisfying ones, I think, for me, are the ones that don't look like visual effects, you know?
Absolutely.
And that's hard, you know? So it's as much the design as it is the execution. If you design something too wacky, it's going to look kind of fake anyway. So it's kind of working with the production designer to come up with something that's plausible, but also pushes the envelope creatively so it looks like what the director wants.
Yeah. There's so many great films on your on your filmography here. I mean, let me just list off a few of them. Escape from New York, E.T., Blade Runner, which you mentioned, Twilight Zone, the movie, Vacation, that's the National Lampoon's Vacation, Temple of Doom.
Yeah. Well, we did. We started in a garage. You know, six of us in a garage, and we built our first motion control system there. So Temple of Doom is something you can do in your garage because we did it. Greg Jean, who's a very well-known model maker who built all the landscapes for Close Encounters, a very renowned model maker, semi-retired today. But he built the trimotor, and we were subcontracted by ILM because, again, of our relationship that way. And so that's a shot where the trimotor is flying over the Great Wall of China, actually, and there's like a little map that comes over and draws where Indy's going. And so we shot the trimotor effect with our blue screen techniques, and then also we built a very large model of the Great Wall of China made out of tinfoil. So that's actually tinfoil and plaster that you're looking at from above. And then the clouds that are going by are some high-speed puffs and also cotton clouds. We got to be very good on Buckaroo Banzai, which I did too. You know, that has we would take thin plexiglass and we would basically with a heat gun warp it, and then we take the stuffing material out of pillows, which is that kind of cotton material, and we'd sculpt these with a hairbrush, and we would hang these cotton clouds, and we make these whole artificial landscapes, you know, or skyscapes with it. Yeah.
Did you ever just sort of sit there and be like, "What are we doing?"
Oh yeah, we do. Well, you know, that's what was fun. Like again on the Abyss, very strange things. Like, you know, we had to come up with ways of making the alien vessels. You know, the manta ship that she touches and the little red whoosh. You know, those are things where we took basically a gentleman named Larry Albright, which is a perfect name for a neon sculpturist, and he used to make these flasks that had noble gases in them, and then we would take magnet wire and wrap it around in circles around this flask, put like 10,000 volts into it, get it to ionize inside the ion thing, and then I would ground strap each one of these little discs, right? right? And so I could get the thing to animate, right?
Yeah.
So I put a stepper motor on that device, would ground strap this thing, and then we took like fiber optic, like a mile of fiber optic. We took a 7-watt argon liquid cool laser, and we're pumping this thing through and getting it to glow. And then we would attack the UV shell with ultraviolet light to get it to glow.
Yeah.
And so it had this 50 passes in the camera to get this thing to look that way, which today we could obviously do in CG. But it was a very interesting kind of organic approach. So then, as an individual, you had to be skilled in optics, materials, electronics, photographic materials, the whole thing. So the more you knew about everything, and pretty much all the things that your mother said don't do that were dangerous, those are the things that came back big time at the end to pull out of the hat. I remember when I did that. Yeah, let's use that, So it's kind of funny, But nowadays it's push button.
Sure.
Yeah. So talk to me about how your career develops. Okay, so you were talking about you worked with Doug Trumbull.
Yes.
And then you talked about you also had your own company.
Yeah, what happened? For 2 years, I worked with Doug Trumbull through the films that we talked about, and it was like going to graduate school because you're working with, at that time, a very small, probably 6 individuals that were the best in the entire world, right? And it was a very small community of skilled. There was no Cinefex. There was nothing on the web. There was no web. You couldn't learn this except being an apprentice. So I was very fortunate. And at that point, we then broke off with a wild, crazy idea. Let's do this in our garage,
Yeah.
So 6 of us, $1,500 each, total of $6,000, started this company. And of course, we sat by the phone waiting for it to ring. It was called DreamQuest Images. And back then, people thought we made mattresses, things like that. So it didn't go anywhere. But again, the individuals that knew us would hire us, and we kept doing it. Very shortly, we then moved to a building, and we started doing visual effects for lower budget films. Again, bringing that high end quality that was only available to those few to the masses. We were very successful. We also started doing special venue, a lot of IMAX, iWorks 8x7D, a lot of simulator rides for Warner Brothers, Disney. We had a commercial division where we had 6 commercial directors, and we did a lot of the television commercials. And that is where the advent of digital technology came from, was from television commercials.
Yeah.
What had happened is that we were all shooting on film, and we would go then to tape. And back then, they didn't actually have, believe it or not, a way of registering the frames from film to the telecine. Right? And so we would get the best we could, and then we'd lace up 12 1-inch machines, and we'd go, and we roll it, and then in the mix bay, we would try to mix this commercial together with these 12 machines, because you couldn't dupe it many times, because if you did, you lost quality, right?
Yeah.
Then some guy got a real wise idea, well, let's put a pin-registered movement in there, and we'll go to a digital medium, right? And that sprang the idea of compositing. So we were already doing very advanced compositing work in the television medium. Right, at things. So I knew for a fact that this would make the leap.
Right.
Then Eastman Kodak came to us and said, we would like to build a process whereby we can do digital compositing. We want to call it Cineon. And then this is Glenn Kennel, who is a brilliant mind behind it. And so he used 3 companies. There was Lucasfilms, there was Apogee, and there was DreamQuest. And so we sat down, and for 2 years, we taught them how to do compositing. I could say, well, here is the analog equivalent of how you do a blue screen. Here's a color difference system. This is the layout that we do, and we taught them that. And then eventually they went off to do it, only to find that they then came back with a machine that would cost $1 million, which none of us could afford, right? And they went in direct competition with the effects vendors by opening up CineSite. And that kind of opened our eyes. And I was furious at that time because we had just finished The Abyss. They had given Lucasfilm what they call a trilinear array, which was technology that allowed us to scan it. And we ended up not having it. So we ended up having to build our own scanner in our machine shop using technology from astronomy. And I found, because I used to do astronomy, and I found liquid-cooled cameras, nitrogen-cooled cameras that were used for shooting the stars. And they had to be very accurate and very cool. So we applied that to an optical printer, which I ripped apart and put this thing inside there, started building it. And then there was no software, right? So then I hired a guy that was at CGraph. I don't know what CGraph is. That's where the computer graphics groups get together. And there was a group with suits and ties. And I went, this doesn't make any sense. No one at CGraph wears suits and ties. And they had these shots of aerial satellite footage of airplanes. I said, well, what do you guys do? Because you don't fit here with suits and ties. Well, we do high-res imaging. I said, really? So I started talking with him, and I convinced one of the guys to leave the company. And it was $90,000 back then, which was all our money. It was this one little board, and it fit in a Sun workstation. And I sat across from him, and I said, you don't know anything about film. I don't know what you do. Here's how we do it. And we went to the same drill again. And we went through and wrote the program and started using it. And Crimson Tide is the first hybrid film where we shot miniature submarines, but we started using digital, torpedoes, and also on the Rock with Michael Bay. Those are our first digital airplanes. Because we were model builders, we knew how to build and texture map. We actually build textures and photograph them, apply them. So it was, again, a hybrid approach. And so we knew that at that time digital didn't support the quality, but bits and pieces of it could. And so we were inching in on the technologies before we could then put it into full service. So we got a really good sense of it.
Yeah. So what was your first job as the guy, visual effects supervisor, the top job for visual effects?
It was probably, it was a number of years ago. Because I had a company, DreamQuest Images, when they came to the company, you pretty much got me, And the reason I think it's crucial that the visual effects supervisor be on the field is that's where the problems begin. You need to be there to help guide them through that, but also to understand the problem. So back at base, you can say, well, this is why we did it, So it was probably like National Lampoon. It was, Blue Thunder was another one that we did. And there was an interesting thing there is that they had originally with John Badham, which I got to know really well, they were flying RC models of the F-16s. I don't know if you remember this shot where it came in to shoot them down out of the sky. And these airplanes were models, RCs were about 6 feet long, and they used what they called ducted fan jets. And so they were gas engines that had a ducted fan, so they were hidden from view. And they had 2 RC pilots, one on the ground and one in the helicopter, where they had a cameraman with an old-fashioned Tyler mount, that's where the guy hangs outside with the mount on spring-loaded things. And they went up and flew some tests, and the guy on the ground would launch the RC airplane in the air, and then the guy in the helicopter would take over control. So they would pass the control over from the RC, and then the RC pilot would fly this alongside a helicopter. Very dangerous.
Yeah.
And it looked kind of interesting until the plane went under the rotor wash, and then it went down. They crashed every single model and crashed it on the I-5. Until the insurance company said, you're done, that's it, And so they came to us and said, we don't want to go to ILM, it's too expensive, can you guys do it? And I said, well, I think we can, And we were very young at that point, and they were all these kids, So we went out and we actually took a Tamiya model, and had Greg Jean paint it all up, and we shot it, and we did it, and we showed it back to the studio, and they said, fantastic. And then we said, well, we'd like just a little bit of money. Oh, you're like that, not going to do that. And they went off, and then eventually came back, and we were hard on the day, and we did the show. And that was one that was probably our first big break into the feature film. Yeah. It was very fun.
So talk about, you've worked with Jim Cameron, you've worked with Spielberg. I'm just looking at all these people, Ridley Scott and Tony Scott. Who do you like the best? Who
my favorite was Tony Scott.
Yeah.
And he is the kind of guy which is super hardworking. He was amazing. He worked harder than anyone on the crew, but he was amazing commander. He was a general. He had a vision, and he wanted to do it. And I remember the very first time. This is when Cameron actually started Digital Domain, and it was funded by IBM. And so we were trying to compete against them. And since they were new and they were digital in the word, it was like we're having a hard time to get any of them out to see our facility even. We had just come off of The Abyss, so I had that kind of working for me. But here's Jim Cameron pushing his company. I think, that's not going to work. Eventually, we had some meetings, and we ended up winning the award. And we had what we call the animatic process. And as opposed to today where we'll use computer graphics to do those, I had cardboard models. So I built these cardboard models of the Akula and the different class submarines we had there. And we used what we call lipstick cameras, which are very small cameras. And we smoked up the room, and I had battery lights and sticks. And so my first introduction to him truly was when he came on our stage, and I'm going with the camera, making the sound effects, and I'm looking at a black and white model, and I got, basically tinfoil and paper making a mountain, and I stop, and they look at me, and he's like, what is this kid doing, And then then you go, well, no, like this. And you come over, and you grab the thing from me, he go, and I knew we were perfect, at that point. And so, again, that was kind of a hybrid working underwater. We did some very interesting things, and this is the stuff what your mother says don't do, where we had to implode the Akula. And what we hadn't seen till that time was a true implosion. And so that was done in a very curious way. At USC, they had an Olympic-sized pool that they were going to demolish. So we said, well, we'd like to use the pool.
We'll help you out.
And we built a 6,000 square foot room over top of it so I could light it, right? And then underwater, I had ex-SEALs. And I hired these guys, and they were amazing. And they went down, and unlike the Abyss, who the only one who could talk to was Jim Cameron through a megaphone, every diver had underwater communication. So I could hear them and I could talk to them from the surface. We had underwater cameras to watch this. And we laid a big steel track, like a dolly track underneath, in which we flew, basically, this it was about a 1,000-pound lead model of the Akula submarine. Wow. And it was, I think, about a 20th scale, and it weighed literally 1,000 pounds. But inside of it were these 6 vacuum jars that we got from England. And so they were set inside. And then we pulled a full vacuum on it. And because of that, it floated now like a dirigible. So we had wires that were, again, using our upside-down technique on the Abyss. I just flipped it the other way around, and it's like a balloon, like a Macy's Day balloon. And so it would be pulled by this thing, right? And then I started doing experiments because he had a very specific idea how he'd like to see this implode, right? I said, okay. So we hired a special effects guy that likes to blow miniatures up, and it's a very specialized field. And I said, well, let's try playing with materials, right? And so we found very quickly that like a primer cord goes off almost instantaneously, but a vacuum is very slow, or a black powder charge. So I found a company in San Pedro who teaches underwater saturation diving. Very strange field, right? Yeah. But they had these surface tanks in which I could put high-speed cameras, and I convinced them to let me put these test pieces into the tank and destroy them, right? And so I run these high-speed film cameras. We're talking 500 frames per second, big film cameras. You wouldn't want to be anywhere near it because it sounds like it's going to blow up. Right. You get this thing going, and then I would detonate using a flash bulb that would mark the frame, and I'd analyze the film afterwards and find out how many milliseconds or how many frames these things did. And then using the simplistic of computer graphics, we were able to sculpt visually what the explosion would do. And oddly enough, in some cases, you had to ignite the black powder charge way early in the sequence, like 190 milliseconds. And then you'd let it go, and then the computer would fire. So we had a computer running the demolition. The dead man switch was the pyro guy, and once he closed it, it would make the circuit live, and then we took control over with the computer, and the computer then ran the detonation sequence, so we could sculpt it. The other problem I never knew about is when you see World War II movies, they drop all those depth charges off, they go boom, and the water goes squirting up. It's not the charge that blows the water out of it. What happens is when you blow something up underwater, it makes a perfect sphere vacuum, and then it's the implosion of the water pressure that comes together that blows it to the ceiling. Big problem. You have hundreds of motion picture lights just 2 inches above, right? So in less than 0.4 seconds, I destroyed probably thousands of dollars worth of lights, and the whole place rocked and thundered, and you go, I wonder if it worked, you know? You couldn't tell, but we got the shot, because it was only 0.4 seconds of real time, but stretched over, 15 times a camera speed, you get the shot.
I'm sure the SEALs enjoyed that.
Yeah, they loved it. They loved it. So we got the biggest, burliest guys, and we had an endless loop, and they pulled the thing, and then an underwater micro switch would trip the computer, and then the computer took over and just blew the thing to crap, And we built these big refrigerator-size camera housings for these high-speed photosonic cameras. And believe it or not, we use baby monitors to tell whether the cameras are up to speed. Because as opposed to an idiot light that just comes on, the camera's running, sometimes you get a jam, you don't know it, right?
Yeah.
So a guy that runs those cameras knows what it sounds like, right? So I said, well, let's use a baby monitor, stick it down inside there, and you can hear, okay, it's running, and then we'd fire off the camera. So it was this wacky world, and you're destroying lots of money and you're blowing stuff up.
Yeah.
Same thing like when we did for Armageddon. I was working on Monty Joe Young. This is Michael Bay now. And they, as movie studios do, they want to release Deep Impact, which is a meteorite movie, the same weekend that they want to have Armageddon. And so they freaked out, and they said, both are Disney shows, and they said, we really want to blow something up big time, and our movie's not epic enough, So I said, well, Michael, I'm working on this other movie, Monty Joe Young for Disney too. They're both Disney projects. I have 100 people on my crew. I can't blow something up for you. He said, you got to come over, right? So I said, okay. So I came down, and he had it on his coffee table, over England, over Paris, like that. And he says, what do you want to blow up? And I said, I don't know, something flat, I think, And luckily enough, I had looked at one of the Popular Science, and that particular month had the big one, which was when the meteorite hitting the Earth, and it showed this massive wave of dirt. And I thought, well, we've seen giant waves, and he had waves in his movie. I said, but no one ever saw a dirt wave before, And I said, well, that might be really interesting. So I thought of the computer technology that we used to detonate the Akula, and I said, well, if I can sculpt Earth to move in a certain way, I probably have an interesting shot. So I said, Michael, I'll do a test behind DreamQuest, which was in a corporate area, and on the other side, about maybe a half mile away, is Costco with all their parking lot and everything. I didn't think about that. and we built this table in which I had, a very short run, and again, these high-speed cameras, because you can't see it in real time, wound them up, had a computer fire the sequence again, and I got dirt to flow like a wave.
Nice.
But in the process, I set off every single car alarm in the process and got the police and fire and all that stuff. But anyway, that's another story. So then eventually I said, well, it would work. And he said, well, I'm going to get the studio to stop Mighty Joe Young, believe it or not, and to do everything. And I got a call from Eisner, and he said, stop everything that you're doing, put 110% on this film. So, okay. So at Handsome Dam, we bought all the quarter-grain pyrochrome in the United States. And this is long before 9/11, and we get the tobacco farm guys like, what are you guys doing? So we built a massive steel platform. It was several hundred feet across, and we had thousands of feet, actually a mile, of concentric rings of quarter-grain primer cord. And we had construction cranes putting in massive deep. And I had to do this shot from the beginning to the end in 6 weeks, It was probably, truly, $500,000 shot.
Wow.
Okay, very expensive. And I didn't really know it was going to work. At the same time, I'm sending, crews to Paris to go up on top of the Eiffel Tower to shoot the plates and everything that way. Anyway, long story short, we had to build an armored bunker to do this. We had multiple cameras because I only could do it once. I didn't have time to build everything again, And I was using sundials and GPS to tell where the sun was, so I could tell the guys where in France to shoot their camera because we didn't know where everything happening was. Literally, so we roll the camera, get the speed. Again, the dead man, we're in a controlled bunker. He holds the down bed switch. We activate the computer. The computer fires a sequence. It rolls the Earth toward us, and it rocked the ground. We got reports that there was earthquakes and things out then, And it was spectacular just looking at the raw footage. Again, something that really happened for real.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It looked fantastic. And then at that point, I went down to show Michael Bay, and he was absolutely thrilled. He said, even more money, put more stuff. So then we got the idea of using the Notre Dame Cathedral, right, and having the gargoyles there, and we shot all that material, and we put this sucker together. And it actually became the iconic image for and that was the thing there. And then when it was done, went back down to the Gorilla Film and finished the Gorilla Film. But it's fun, And those are the kinds of exciting moments that you get, where insanity rules, and you get a drawing on a napkin, which is worth $500,000, $500,000,
It makes me wonder if Michael Bay ever calls anyone for any reason other than to blow something up.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, he must just make that call like 10 times a day.
Exactly. But
you gotta come blow something up for me.
But it's the kind of call you want.
Exactly. So I do want to talk about Mighty Joe Young real quick because I'm a fan of the original.
Yes.
And I'm wondering how you felt about kind of covering some material that was so iconic from the early days.
It was special to me because actually Mighty Joe Young was animated by Ray Harryhausen. And he's and still is my mentor and my hero, stuff like that. So I got to meet him really well on that. It was a decision that was early made by the studio that Rick Baker, which I got to know real well, was going to be basically a man in a suit. And no one can do a gorilla better than Rick Baker can, And so I want to just tell a little quick story because this is the insanity that happens at the studio. They were trying to greenlight this picture, right? And they weren't sure that they really wanted to make think. So I was part of this meeting. It was at Disney Studio. The head of the studio was sitting at this massively long table, which they have at Disney, and he was sitting at the far end. And Rick comes in, and he's got this baby gorilla. It was the baby version of Mighty Joe. And they have a guy named Mark Centurion who has a large control system with giggles and gadgets, and he walks in with radio antennas and all that kind of stuff. And Rick's there, and he says, I want to show you something. And he takes this thing, and he throws it onto the table. And Mark goes like this with the controls, and this thing runs about 40 feet.
Oh, my gosh.
And David Vogel's going like this, and he goes, jumps and goes wham right in his thing. And David goes, green light. And that was it. It was Vernon Troyer. That was his first movie experience in a baby gorilla suit.
Wow. Oh, wow.
He was small enough to fit in that, and the only thing that was mechanical was the head. It was a guy in a suit running at it right there. So that was it. So what was interesting was that movie had a different set of problems, and that is, it's a guy in a suit, but we don't want to be locked down.
Right.
And again, this is still in the photographic world. It's photochemical. It's not digital. And so if you remember Darby O'Gill and the Little People, this was again in front of camera where you're using forced perspective to give the illusion of scale. Well, in that process, if you move the camera, the illusion is broken, right? So I said, well, let's come up with a different idea. Let's take and use motion control, which is typically non-real time. let's design a new rig that goes fast enough, okay, and under control, and scale the moves so that I can move a camera on location. And then I can change the frame rate of the camera to give the proper speed, the appropriate speed for the Mighty Joe, and scale the camera rig orthogonally so that I can keep the two in sync. It really had never really been done before. So I expressed this to the studio, and they said, okay, we have to test this. And I said, okay. So we rigged a machine, and we actually got an award for building a high-speed, dolly for afterwards. And we went out into to one of the parks there in Burbank, and we shot tests, and we got it to work. And so that movie has some very super simplistic, basic technology, but done with a new twist, One of which was, they had this big, massive mechanical hand, and even Rick Baker building this thing is not very dexterous, and it had to, for instance, lift the lid and let the leopard jump out, which was one of the sequence there. And they tried for hours with this big thing, and the cat's freaking out because it's got this mechanical arm. It just didn't work. And I said, well, let's do it a different way. So what we did is we took the cage, which had no top on it at that point. It was a plexi top. And then we brought a miniature version of the cage, like about 15 feet above, and I put the camera up top, So use, again, a basic forced perspective shot, and I had John, who's the puppeteer, with a normal hand from Mighty Joe. He just reaches and grabs and pulls it out, and it works really well. So that was really neat, and that was actually our first venue into digital characters. And we worked with ILM. They did the daytime version, and we did the nighttime version, and that's using very primitive Maya at that time with hair programs that we wrote, and we did the first digital characters that had to intercut with a real suit. And that's my kind of segue into starting to use, instead of starfields and explosions, now building characters that are on the one sheet and our main characters speaking roles, and that is where I've kind of gone from that point forward. I've kind of focused on films that have, digital characters like, Jack.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what I'm looking at. So, you just finished up Jack the Giant Slayer.
Yes, that was a poor film that kind of went in the... Yeah, exactly. It wasn't a bad film. The problem with that is Bryan Singer, who I got to know pretty well, was really making Jurassic Park, but with giants.
Yeah.
And I don't know how this could happen, but it did. A year and a half after we had made it, in the process of making it, the studio watches it and they go, oh my God, we can't release this. Kids are going to be freaked out. This is not the film we want to make, And they kind of went in this whole tizzy. And so they tried to change it around. By then, the concrete's kind of hardened, and the marketing department really didn't know how to handle it. And so, as we talked earlier, I think, for most people with families, it might be a little too intense, for smaller children. And then for the older ones, like my son who's 15, it probably wasn't cool enough. So it really fell in this weird position. The work, I think, though, was actually really good. It's Avatar plus. We went beyond that, and it's something where I think the community of visual effects appreciate it, but the general audience probably just never saw it.
Sure. So talk to me about the world as it stands right now. I mean, we're in an era where even if you have a live actor, probably not working with any real set, especially. I mean, even looking at something like the recent Star Wars films was all blue screened, all digital sets, essentially.
I think there could be abuse of digital, which happens a lot nowadays because it's easier to say, well, we'll just fix it in post. That's the war cry. It used to be flop it, crop it, or drop it. I mean, if you didn't get it on the set, and then unless you did something, you wouldn't get it. I think in today's world, it's still having vision. It's like almost like in audio where they try to postpone the decision making as far as they can, and so many times they'll use effects because they don't want to commit to something. Those who have a strong vision are much more open to the idea of doing something more permanent. The industry at large is in a tough position because as the technology has gone horizontal and as the level and quality has kind of escalated, much like any high-tech industry where labor is the most expensive thing, the labor is now being outsourced to countries where they have incentive. So, for instance, in Canada, it's between 35 and 45%. Back to the studios, So that means that California is being decimated at the moment in terms of doing work in California. It's still being designed and it's posted there, but in terms of actual work, it's being done around the world, which is kind of sad. So one of the reasons I'm here is kind of the vision idea that I have. And on Jack the Giant Killer, I was kind of exposed more to the gaming side, not in the true sense of the word, but using gaming engines to do real-time rendering for what we call simulcast. simulcam. That was an expression that Jim Cameron had. And what that is when you're doing motion capture, you're working in a void, essentially, with a bunch of talented actors who are dressed in funny costumes with dots all over them, you know, which they have to get over. But once they do, it's I call the digital sandbox. It's actually very fun. But in this way, we're using simulcam. You have the ability to be able to take literally an iPad with photoreflective dots on it, and I can hold it up as almost my magic mirror, and I can see through it what is essentially a game-level version of what I would see in the movie, right? So I can see a giant sitting at a table doing that way. It has some advantages over what we would call blind capture. Blind capture would be how Zemeckis directs. Most of the Polar Express, Monster House, things like that. It's more like theater, where you have all the actors together and they just perform, right? And you're recording the motion. You have no real thought or care of how you frame it. But if you've done photography, you know the first thing you do is kind of get a little closer together. Or if you're going in for a close-up on an actor, he just realizes that you're doing a close-up, so he's not going to be too broad in his action. That information's not available to him if you don't know where you're putting the camera. So the simulcam is a way of using it. And as I got into it, I started realizing the power of rendering in real time. And some of the things I started finding out, for instance, like an i5 phone, you know, the iPhone has the same rendering capability as the original Xbox. You know, you go, oh my God, that's pretty amazing, you know? Or that, for instance, the original Toy Story, you know, back 16 years ago, whenever it was, took 8 hours a frame at Pixar to render. On your iPad, I can run it at 60 frames a second now.
Yeah.
Moore's Law is very alive and well.
Exactly.
Or, for instance, there are like 67 million Xboxes in the world, all connected to the internet. Or there are similar number of PlayStations, right? Now, people think of them as gaming consoles, but in fact, they are actually portals, right? And so one of the more interesting concepts was, if I was making a movie today, why do I render it? In other words, Hollywood, for the most part, whether you're making a live-action film, you shoot it, you post it, you avid it, you know, you post it DI, and you present a completed number of frames, right? Same thing with a CG movie, you render it, that guy. But what would happen if you didn't actually post it, if you didn't actually render it? You sent what essentially is the scene file to the client, and on his device, he renders it. Now what you have is you have interactivity. And the device I brought here today is a thing called the Oculus Rift.
I've heard of this.
And you've heard of it, yeah.
Yes.
It was 2 years ago at E3, where a gentleman who graduated from USC had for 10 years had the thrill of building VR. And ever since 1984, when we had Lawnmower Man, remember that movie?
Oh, yeah.
Exactly, you know, we were promised VR, and it just hasn't happened, you know. And it isn't that they didn't exist, but those headsets were between $3,000 and $9,000, you know, so mere mortals didn't buy them.
We have a little VR setup called The Cave set up here on campus, but it's very clunky. You're in a big room.
Yeah, a holodeck kind of idea. Exactly, yeah. But as you see that, in other words, for $250 or $350, it's going to go. And again, this E3, they were the hit of the pavilion. They just received $16 million of funding directly from that actual show. They're well on their way, you know. And the HD version, which is the modified version, is spectacular. So as I started seeing that, as an indie filmmaker, one of your problems is distribution, you know. And the studios pretty much have their finger on the control. You can't get beyond that. And if you look at the music industry, similar things happen to that, where you were, unless assigned to a label, you couldn't get your CDs out to Virgin Record, right? But who does that nowadays? No one, right? You go to iTunes, you download it. Now you can self-produce. The same thing, I believe, can happen in that. So it is not replacing film, and it's not replacing games, but it's, I use the expression, taking peanut butter and chocolate and making a Reese's bar. I don't have to make anything. You know, the distribution is in place. The hardware is available. You know, the engines, the technology is there. It's thinking outside the box and being creative as how you actually use that. And it's developing a whole new thing. If you think about medical, NPR had a couple articles on the aged, you know, and the golden years. They find that older people who are maybe very good with their mind but are disabled can't do it. Imagine them going down a rafting trip with their friend, because it's, again, a social medium. You can do it. That's why kids play games, half of it, which is just to be talking to their friends over the comm, right? You know, so I am extremely excited about that. Now, this is what I call disruptive technology, right?
Yeah.
And it's something where I've gone to a Jerry Bruckheimer group and I show them this, and they go, well, that's really cool, you know, it's neat. Yeah. But they don't have to move. That's not their deal. They're at the top of the heap of what they do, and this is what would you want to do that for? I don't know. If you go to a gaming company, it's the same kind of thing. They're a large studio. They have commitment and investment. It's dangerous, and when you're describing something that no one's done, why would you want to do that? Where here at a university, it's perfect because you have that kind of what I call the petri dish. If let's say you're an architect and you want to build a $100 million building, well, why would you not do it first here, walk inside? Acoustically, you can use binaural sound, and you can do impulse recordings of what the glass sounds like so you can actually hear what it sounds like to talk.
I was told, my department just moved into a new building.
Yeah.
And when they were building that building, one of the things they did was they went to the cave that they call it, put on the VR goggles, and were able to demo the furniture in the actual space.
Absolutely.
But not everyone has access to a massive room with all this technology behind it.
But all that technology is for, a couple $1,000 you can get a PC that drives it. The gaming engines in some cases are absolutely free. It's being a clever innovator. You're not necessarily a creator, but you're just innovating on what's there. In the health industry, we met a couple doctors out of Seattle that have been using VR for treatment on burn units. In other words, they for 12 years have documented the advantages of using pain reduction during the treatment processes where they have VR. Now their VR is pretty simplistic. It's a Arctic scene with penguins and snowmen. And they don't have the resources to really do what we could really do. But it's clever. And if you start thinking kind of nefariously, if you say, imagine who wouldn't want to visit Hogwarts Castle?
Sure. Yeah.
And have a tour guide from Dumbledore, right? Or if you think about it more commercially, let's say that you had Dagon Alley, right? And you wanted to walk through that and be in that world, and then maybe go into one of the candy stores and order something which comes to you via Amazon.
Yeah.
Right? Or maybe you have a thing where, since say you have a Porsche dealership and it's the most wild Porsche dealership, you walk in and it's beautiful, it's all glass, it's spacious, and there sits the car of your dreams, right? You walk up to it, you can change its color, you can work on the wheels, open the door, sit down inside, change the leather, listen to the stereo with impulse recording of the actual environment, so you're actually hearing it as it would sound through that headset, and then take it out for a spin. Wouldn't that be neat?
Yeah.
And from a commercial standpoint, you are living in their commercial. And that's what they want you to do, So it has huge potential. Now, getting corporations to understand that and hear that, oddly as it sounds when it starts adding up, it's hard to do. And so this is where I believe a university would come. Or if you're working in science, and we have a group that does DNA, and the guy says, you wouldn't believe this after he saw the demo. He said, I'm sitting here on command line, trying to do this analysis of DNA for cancer stuff. And he said, boy, if I could just visualize what this thing looked like and I could put it together, we're visual creatures, you would come up with a lot more stuff. So I think it's a brave new world. I think it opens up things. I think it's going to be like the recording industry where it's going to change rather suddenly, You look at the gaming industry, it's a $67 billion industry with a 30% growth. You look at film, it's a $27 billion industry with flat line. A lot of things competing for their dollar. And so I just think for those who are very talented and are forward-thinking is where we ideally would want to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is fascinating. Fascinating. Hoyt, you can come and tell stories on our podcast any old time you like.
Well, thank you.
Let us know. I will clear the schedule next time you're in town. Hoyt Yeatman, visual effects supervisor. Take a look at his filmography. You have seen a lot of his work.
Well, thank you.
A lot of his work.
Thank you.
October 8th and 9th, you'll be back showing some films.
Yep, exactly. Talking about probably some of the older ones too, because I have a lot of behind the scenes, which are just interesting to see.
Excellent.
The evolution of visual effects.
Yes, that will be great.
Yep.
Well, we'll get out of here.
Okay.
We won't. I would love to just sit here and talk all night because I think we could, but. We got to end sometime. Our cameras don't last for that long.
No.
So,
but we're not going to blow anything up either.
No, exactly. No.
Sadly. Maybe next time.
Maybe after
next
this.
Time, exactly.
After this, we'll go find something to blow up.
Yeah.
All right. Hoyt, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
We will get out of here. Thank you guys for watching and listening. Yeah. My name is Andy.
I'm Jason.
This has been, and always will be, A Place for Film. A Place for Film is recorded at WFIU Studios in Bloomington, Indiana.